So here's our topic for today. We're going to talk about migrations to North America, to Australia and to New Zealand, mainly North America, and of course where they went in those parts. And it's a very interesting topic, a very large topic. I'll probably have to limit the extent that we cover up to the period when more records were available. So the benefit of today's session is a bit like DNA, that you'll get a chance to think about where your ancestors might have gone to because of the historical trends, rather than having a piece of paper that says they went there. And it will make more sense that you find them in places that you didn't expect they might be. And you'll have the background to why they might have got to that place. So here's a quick overview. We are going to talk about the science and the industrial revolution, really, that prompted a lot of change that went on in the parts of the world where we find Scots. Of course, don't forget there's the softer side, the huge cultural change of the enlightenment that happened in the 1700s. We're going to talk about these changes, what they meant for overpopulation and poverty in the highlands that motivated many to leave. Obviously the politics and the wars and the possible destinations for them came out of this change that was happening at that time. And we're going to deal mainly, as I said, with places where there's limited documentation of people actually moving around. To know what the trends were generally would be an advantage to help you to research your ancestors. It was really beneficial, the feedback that you gave in the registration process. So thank you for that. And before we start, I can already hear that a couple of people have got their microphones on. Can you all just check, because I can't see who it is that has their microphone on, but somebody does. I can hear the clattering going on. Is that okay? If somebody found them, all turn them off. That'd be great, unless you're asking a question. Now, you might like a pen to take some notes. That could be helpful. This is a little quote here that my friend Chris from New Zealand sent to me. That's the only reference in this Napier Commission that happened in 1883, which was designed to, that's quite a late stage compared to what we're talking about, but it was designed to investigate what the lives of the so-called crofters, that means self-sufficient people, was like and why they were suffering so much. And this Alexander MacLennan, who came from this part near Rasay, near Skye, said that he went down to the wharf and he saw the people there. They were like lambs separated from their mothers. Oh. And then an old fella said, should I go to Australia? I might die on my arrival. I should prefer to stay in Rasay, but I must go. This is a quote in the Napier Commission, a famous thing, you know, and I think that's where you often hear the word crofter in that context. Okay, so let's just recap, because it's been really this session was meant to follow on immediately from where did my ancestors live, but we interposed the session about DNA because Ali couldn't do it. In this time slot, he's going to be away. So just to recap where we got up to when we were talking about where did my ancestors live. These are some of the sort of things that were happening when we last left this topic, really. You know, we'd had the Scottish Reformation, John Knox and so on. In the 1600s, you had the Scottish king becoming King James I of England as well as of Scotland, but separately. Then you had the later tumultuous period of the Stuarts in the late 1600s, the Commonwealth and so on, and the Restoration, and you know, Protestantism being looked down on. I mean, Catholicism being looked down on. And in 1707, you had the Acts, plural, of Union, meaning that Scotland had an act and England had an act, and that brought them together, separate acts, and they brought them together. Not everybody in Scotland thought it was a good idea, you'll be surprised to hear. And then once Anne and William had fallen off the perch, the Hanoverian kings arrived, the Georges, or known as the Georgian period, from Hanover, but they kept their titles in Hanover, their responsibilities in Hanover. and not all English were keen on having them either. That's the other way of thinking of it too. And then at that time you had the first Jacobite rising, as they were called, two of them actually, but it was called the first, the 15. And then you had the 45, which was the second known as the second Jacobite rising, which were attempts to put the Stuarts back on the throne that we saw before, the James people, and that ended in tears at Culloden Moor. So then you've got people going off to Highlanders, being treated rather poorly. I said in the last session like this that they were treated like natives were treated in foreign parts. Then just not long after Culloden, you have what's called French and Indian War. That's the North American name for that, those engagements in North America. And that Indian there, of course, means, First Nations, you might call them, people, Native Americans. And then you have the name that war was given in Europe was the 7 Years' War. And I would see that those three things lead on to the rebellion of the 13 colonies in North America on the East Coast. They're all a continuum, really. You have Highlanders migrating to the Carolinas that we were talking about earlier, and then on to particularly the Maritimes in Canada initially at this stage. And then from the end of the 1700s till Waterloo, Britain was at war, serious, big war all around the world with France, the Napoleonic Wars, as they're called. This is like a bit of a recap of what was happening over that period. Let's think about Nova Scotia, because this is quite an interesting thing, Nova Scotia. It wasn't until the Acts of Union in 1707 that Scots had access to English colonies, meaning they were treated like foreigners in those parts. In Jamestown, in the Chesapeake generally, and in Massachusetts Bay, in Boston and so on, they were not welcome. They were treated as, Scots were treated as outsiders. Now James, going back quite a way, in the last years of his life, James the first of England really, but the sixth of Scotland, the James who became the monarch we talked about a minute ago, had this rather favourite, I gather. He's known as the Secretary for Scotland, Sir William Alexander. I think he's from around Stirling Way, around that part. And James granted him all of Nova Scotia, as it was called. And that included today's parts that are called separate names, like particularly PEI, Prince Edward Island, then known as Ile Saint-Jean, and Cape Breton, known as Ile Royale at that time, but also Maine and the mainland New Brunswick were all part of this area. It was designated as everything between New England and Newfoundland. Was covered by this grant that he made, and there's a whole lot of wording you can find about it, but he created these baronets who were baronets of Nova Scotia to encourage, if they would encourage settlers to go and live in this larger Nova Scotia part. He died in 23, I think, or 24, James, but his son Charles took over this mission to create baronets in Nova Scotia. In fact, they designated a little part of Edinburgh Castle to be actually known as part of Nova Scotia, where they could bring these people along and on the native soil of Nova Scotia, aka Edinburgh Castle, they could be given their baronetcy to be a baronet in Nova Scotia. And by 1625, there were 22 of these people. who, you know, they were like previously knights or various nobility, but also people who had money. You know, money, that's a good, speaks a lot. People who'd made money in various ventures. It didn't work out too well. The French, you know, really put a pay to that and hassled them to get out and not make much of a go of it. But that was the idea. In the late 1600s, they had this thing called the Darien scheme. It's Darien. It's a little peninsula, I think, but it's in today's Panama. And it was, you know, of course, a disaster. You know how Jamestown and particularly Roanoke Island before that were great disasters as well. You know, that's a well-documented thing, not just in Boston was there trouble settling in initially. But this Darien scheme, lots of people died. They sent replacements and more people died, and just a bit like the same story as Jamestown. But in the end, there were huge financial losses and great embarrassment to the wealthy of Scotland who had invested in this scheme, been duped really by a con man who talked them into it. And in a way that triggered it gave impetus to Scots becoming part of the same union with England, so that the Scots were, you know, embarrassed into they were obviously had to find some other way of getting colonies, and to get in bed with the English was one way to do it. So this is we're just talking about how we're creating opportunities for migrating, and they're not looking very good at this stage, are they? What's happened? Let's just think again a little bit about these this part of the world here. It's a very simplistic drawing here, but this in 1700, this is the time we're talking about. You've got a great big area of New France, which you know, based around the St. Lawrence Seaway. You've got the British controlled area of Nova Scotia here, but does not include PEI and Cape Breton and so on. And then you've got the Hudson Bay Company bringing, you know, people across to do fur buying and so on in and around Hudson's Bay, and the great unexplored area out here in New Spain further down. Hudson Bay Company, just briefly, let's talk about that because this is a chance. And don't forget, there was a big connection. If you go to Orkney, I suggest you go slightly to the west of Kirkwall, and you'll see all this stuff about how they had such a huge connection from there with Hudson Bay Company. It's a really good thing to do if you're traveling in that part of the world. Because they went up the east coast of Britain and then to Orkney, where they picked up supplies and sailors, such that the canoes that were used in the Hudson Bay Company were styled after Viking canoes. You know, Kirkwall and the Orkneys were ruled by Norse long after the rest of Scotland became more independent from Norway, or from the Vikings, really, as we saw earlier. So the Royal Charter was granted in 1670, so we know that sort of period. It's known as Rupert's Land. I've forgotten now exactly, but Rupert was a person. They bought furs and in exchange for blankets, and they controlled that huge, huge area, more like a separate country, really, for a couple of centuries. After 1774, York Factory, that's a location up on the Hudson Bay there, a little bit further north than earlier, became the main base of the Hudson Bay Company. I've talked about the close connection with Orkney. The Scots from there played a very important part in it. And for a time there, after the acquisition of Quebec by the British, you had this Norwest Company, the Norwesters, who were in competition with the Hudson Bay Company to get furs. And they went from Thunder Bay inland from there and came up against them for a while until this date where they were merged. There's a wonderful book, actually. I had a copy. Did anybody read that book? I'd like to hear. Anybody who has read that book that's called A Dance Called America? It's in the list of reading. It's really such a good book about this operation, Nor'westers and the Hudson Bay Company, Red River settlement, all those sort of things. It's terrific. I'd have a look at it in the reading list. And it wasn't until 1869 that Hudson, that huge area of land, was sold to Canada to become part of Canada. A bit of the land went down into below the now border between the US and Canada, Hudson Bay, the catchment area. I think it must be the Red River catchment that goes into, would it be North Dakota? One of those. Okay, let's talk about this, which is, a bit of a trigger for a lot of events. We saw how the Hanoverians, Georges, came in the 1714. The Stuarts had been the kings since 1603 and were ousted when, after the Republic. And their king in waiting, you might say, was in exile in France and the Vatican and other places. And that's where we get the name Jacobite from the name James. Jacob is the Latin word for James. And his son, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, known to many of you, arrived in South Uist, a place called Eriskay. I've been there. It's quite just a nice little beach, really. There's a little marker there to say this is where Prince Charles arrived in Scotland to start the Jacobite Rising of 45. And he brought with him a number of French and Irish regular soldiers, trained, a lot of guns, a lot of rifles he brought, and they, 6,000 of them, marched, occupied most of Scotland and marched as far south as Derby or Derby, they say, which is only 200 kilometres from London. And in London, there were quite a few people waiting for quite a few supporters of the Jacobite cause, because they were a bit annoyed with these Georges they'd had, and various other reasons. Not only religious, it's a misunderstanding to say they were religious. They had other reasons. Now, the Duke of Cumberland, who is described as the butcher of Culloden, or the butcher of Cumberland, Prince William, is the third youngest son of the king, King George II. It's often forgotten that that's who he was. He's the king's son. He rose to some prominence in this event, but didn't do too well. This is a picture of him up here in 1821, when he's, young and spunky. At the time of this landing of Charles in Scotland, William was in Flanders with a British force of who were really supporting the Hanoverians as much as they were implementing British policy, because they, don't forget, the Georges still had Hanoverian control. They were in charge in both places. They weren't called kings there because that was too small to be a kingdom. William, Duke of Cumberland, was recalled from Flanders with his 12,000 troops, including the famous James Wolfe's regiment. James Wolfe, we're going to hear more about him later, aren't we? All you Canadians know about James Wolfe. Yes, please. And the Jacobites, the 6,000 who were in Derby, were they had there was a lot of discussion about whether they should go on to London, stay where they are, go back to Scotland. In the end, they decided they would return to Scotland. Perhaps, you know, it was a mistake. Who knows? Who can say now at this point? But anyway, they eventually met just to the east of Inverness. A lot of you have been there, I guess, to Culloden. Yes, nodding, no nodding, yes, yes. It's a wonderfully, when I went there in the 70s, it was just a bleak bit of, you know, grass. But the modern visitor centre is much better. It's one of the best curated visitor centres I've ever been in, really. And they have this terrific thing of giving you both sides. You walk along one side of the passage and you get the Jacobite point of view, and you walk along the other side and you get the Hanoverian point of view. It's really quite well done. You know, unlike most things that just tell the story of the winners. I think it's fair to say that. You see this picture? Anybody like to turn their mic on and suggest what's the point of this picture that everybody's seen, right? This picture is so, like even a BBC documentary on the period used this picture to illustrate what it was like in those days. Anybody like to tell me what's the point of this picture? Who's that?
It's firepower versus knives, basically, right? Swords and stuff.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point. Yep. Any more comments?
Yes.
I can't see you speaking, but anyway.
Steve Hopkins.
Now, Steve, yep.
Yeah, I see that the British have a formal straight line, whereas the Scots have the Scottish charge going on.
Yeah, that's it. Bit of a wild affair. There's a word, hirsute. Do you know that word, hirsute? It means basically hairy. You know, all these people, they're looking quite hairy, right? You know, and disorderly. Now, it won't be any surprise to you to learn that that the artist of this picture was under the patronage of William the Prince, the Duke of Cumberland. He was his, you know, he was his patron, the artist. So once you know that, you begin to think, oh, I see what's happening here. This is a victors tell the story type, you know, exercise. There's a wonderful book. I think I might have shown you this when you were at, I can't see my own picture, I don't know why. You can still hear me though, can't you? I don't know if you can see that book, but it's a book by a professor from Glasgow University, and it's in the list of reading, and he talks about the errors in this picture. He says, for one thing, we know that the Charles brought with him a shipload of many more rifles than he needed. In fact, the Highlanders generally did not flock to his side the way he might have expected. So he actually had an oversupply of guns. So there's a mistake. You know, there's not one. It's all these swords and targes. That's those shields that are had been used historically in Scottish battles. And you know, this thing here is called a Lochaber axe. And they ceased to be used some time before this battle occurred. So they're just a historic anachronism in this painting. Furthermore, you know, you can see they're all very neatly lined up, quite a few. Look at all the guns in a row, all these rifles perfectly drilled. You know, it's all just too much to be true, isn't it, really? The uniform's not a splatter of mud anywhere, you know, and yet these are all dirty and grubby looking.
All different tartan, Go.
Well, you know, and some people would say the wrong tartan. Anyway, yes, quite likely as well, given what we know about this picture generally. And the most decisive part of the engagement was actually that the Hanoverian side had better artillery, mortars and cannon type of things. You know, these stubby little ones that they used. And the Jacobites did not have artillery like that, so it doesn't even feature here. The main winning thing of the battle. Furthermore, it has this picture here of the exposed thigh, that rather sexy exposed Scottish thigh that some of you know so well. And it's suggesting, you know, that there might not be anything worn under the kilt. And that this fellow, and Scots in general, might be a threat to the daughters of respectable English folk. Need I go on? Is that enough, John? Have I said enough? So this is really, you know, all you can conclude from this picture that is used commonly as being an illustration of what the battle was like, is that it's what Donald Trump would call fake news. Yeah, that's it. Fake news. You get the idea. So don't take much notice of that picture if you see it. What was the aftermath of this event on Culloden Moor? Well, James Wolfe, you know, now James Wolfe, you've got to keep this name in mind here, you remember, who was the significant part of the thing, told his colleague that they should make as few Highlanders prisoner as they could. That meant shoot them. So if they were on the field half dead, just shoot them. And so for several days after the battle, they rounded up anybody who was looking like a potential member of the Charles's Jacobites. And don't forget, there were a lot of regulars. That's a point I should have made in that slide there, that there were, you know, they didn't give their orders in Gaelic. So they call it a Highland Army, but actually they didn't give their orders in Gaelic. They didn't, there were the Irish and the French regulars were involved in the battle. None of them appear in this picture. They're all talked about broadly as Highlanders, not the main troops that were engaged. The chief of the Fraser clan, Lord Lovat, known as Simon the Fox, Simon Fraser, was executed. I think he might be the last in Britain to be executed, having switched sides to the Jacobites quite late in the performance. A lot of people were taken prisoner, great numbers, you know, thousands, many thousands, many of whom were granted remission from being a prisoner, whatever the word is, you know, were let out if they would agree to enlist, and then they were sent off to hellholes like Jamaica and Antigua and places where they were expected to die or, you know, be chopped up in battles in North America. So it wasn't a very happy outcome to accept this offer of being recruited into the army. More estates were confiscated. Quite a few, you remember, were confiscated in the first Jacobite rising, and just after the battle there at Glenshiel near Kintail. But something that people don't usually know is that just after Culloden, sorry, I'll just do these other two, they're a bit out of order. There was the proscription of the plaid. What does that mean, proscription of the plaid? It's a fancy way of saying banning tartan. Yeah, plaid, that's tartan. Proscription means, you know, prohibiting. So, you know, these are all things that people know quite widely, and you've all heard that before. But something I think you might not have heard before is that this act, the Heritable Jurisdictions Act, came in a couple of years later. And the point of that was that they were like local, you wouldn't call them courts, but an institution. The lairds in the local parishes had the ability to manage their communities by getting people allowed to air their grievances and settle and have disputes settled at the local level with local people that they knew. But this Heritable Jurisdictions Act did away with that and said that people had to go to the court system, the national court system, to resolve disputes. And of course, this took away the localness of people being in communities and drove a wedge between the people generally and their lairds, their, you know, not necessarily historic lairds, but the people who owned their lands, were driven apart by not having a place where they could go and settle disputes locally. So you'd think generally it was quite a progressive thing to do, but in fact was had the opposite effect by making the lairds something different to the people and not having ability to deal with each other in a communal way. So this is quite a big thing. I don't know if you read the chapter that I recommended. The first item on the agenda was this book, which has chapter 9 I recommended, which talks about this recruiting period, but it talks about these issues like the Heritable Jurisdictions Act and so on. You can read this book, of course, in our histories. Yeah, it was given to me to publish there by Malcolm Lobban, James MacLennan, that's Fiona's dad. And they spent a huge amount of money, the Crown spent a huge amount of money building this fort, which some of you have been to. Hands up, say yes if you've been to it. Fort George. It's just near the Culloden field, actually. George has been there. It's just near Culloden field, and it pokes out into the Moray Firth, which is in just there where Inverness, just along from Inverness in that waterway, pokes out. But if you look at this here, you can see, look at this, the walls, usually you'll see photos of forts taken looking this way, right? Not looking from this side. And many of the photos of this fort are in fact taken in that direction, as you would normally do for a fort, because forts are normally built to repel ships that are coming to invade you, aren't they? That's the normal fort thing. But you see this, that's a piddling little wall out there on the seaside, as it is along here, just to keep a bit orderly looking. It's not to defend against anybody. And there's not any particularly big cannons or anything facing in that direction. That's interesting, isn't it? But look at this here, this huge wall along this side here. What's that all about? Anybody like to turn their mic on and tell me? Why is it so? George, you know, come on. Give it a go. Give it a shot. He's not game. What's the point of it?
Is it to just keep them from climbing up over it?
Yeah, that's right. But why would there be people coming this way? Who are they
going to
avoid
land invasion?
A land attack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, so this is built to protect the British Crown forces and the like against attack from Highlanders. They're building it to protect the British, the Hanoverians, from Highlanders' attacks from the land side. Isn't that an amazing thing? They're not some built to protect again, because they controlled the seas all around here, right? There's no doubt that British Navy would be controlling these seas. You don't have to defend yourself against a naval attack here. There's no chance of it, is there? So why you, and they spent on this thing, they started off thinking it was going to cost £92,000, which was a huge amount. And it finished up costing over £200,000, so like more than double what they expected. And the amount they spent building this thing was more than the gross domestic product of Scotland altogether. They spent as a symbol of their control of the Highlands and of and giving them the ability to defend themselves against the Highlanders. Amazing, isn't it? And it was built, and look how long it took to build. More than 20 years. Spent a lot of money. So at the same time, we've got great increases in the population of the Highlands from the Culloden basically through till the 1840s. The population of the Highlands, despite immigration, went up by 55, more than half. What was happening? Why could this be that you have overpopulation happening in the Highlands? Well, we saw it when we were looking at the Strath. Someone's got their mic on. Can you check, please? We saw in the Strathconnan that couples were getting married and they had nowhere to go and live, so they would stay on living with the parents of either the bride or the groom, and meaning that housing, you know, little houses they were. Remember, we saw that little house with the 2 chimneys and the fella standing by the wall. Those sort of houses would become lived in. They probably lived in the animal side of it. The young married, the newlyweds, some honeymoon, and the summer pastures, shieldings as they're called, were taken over. Particularly, we saw that there, but you know, there was nowhere else, no new land available. They knew where it all was. They couldn't go west, young boy. So they started moving in on the summer pastures to farm year round, especially the lower level ones that weren't snowed over in the winter. And the potato, remember we saw that the potato had arrived in Europe from the conquistadors going to Peru. This is my Peru jumper I've got on, as you know, that I bought at Machu Picchu this year. But I learned when I was there about the potato coming, you know, from Peru and Bolivia to Europe. And we saw in the old statistical accounts in the 1790s that the ministers would talk about the potato is now well established here in this parish. Yeah? Isn't that an amazing thing, that the potato? And of course it was a great thing, the potato, because it didn't grow on the surface and be exposed to, you know, great winds and too much moisture and all these sort of things. So the potato was providing nutrients, and the calorific value of potatoes is so much greater than a kilo of grain. And also it grows in a far smaller space than does grain. So it's a wonderful thing, the potato, in its own way. And it provided nourishment that, you know, meant the population could increase much more than it had in the past. And also in the highlands, they had found a way of curing smallpox. You know, there's Jenner who takes all the credit, but Jenner didn't make his discoveries known until 1796. But in the highlands, you had this fellow called John Williamson, known locally as Johnny Notions, who had created a solution for smallpox in the islands of Scotland that became known around much earlier, like particularly in the mid to 1780s. He had a solution for smallpox. So that saved a lot of deaths from young children. Cattle selling prices increased dramatically, so that was another source of income that meant they could be better fed and could increase, and their population could increase. The Napoleonic Wars were forcing up the price of supplies for the soldiers, like meat and potatoes and wool for uniforms, of course. And potash, that's another thing that became popular, we'll talk about in a minute. Potash is used in the manufacture of glass and soap. It's an alkaline. And soldiers who'd gone off in these wars, these many wars that were being fought at the time, were sending back money to their families to give them another source of income. Okay, let's move on now to talk about potential places where people might move to. And you've got, you know, North America beckoning, not far over the Atlantic there. But you've got this enormous fort there in the gateway to the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is my photo of Louisbourg as it's been recreated as a sort of, a visitor centre, visitor experience. This has been recreated at 1744. That's what it's meant to look like. You been there? So who's been to Louisbourg, just down from Sydney, Nova Scotia? Yep, Peggy's been there. I can't see everybody. It's a great experience. Yeah. George has been there twice. Oh, you got a question, George? No. So the wars with between France and England were being resolved by this Treaty of Utrecht in 1714, and France refused to give up what they call Ile Saint-Jean, or what we call today PEI, and the Cape Breton, which, you know, is known as it was called by the French Ile Royale, which are there at the headway, the entrance to the St. Lawrence Seaway. So, and of course, this is the big area where cod came from, particularly cod. You know, the fishing banks off Newfoundland and Cape Breton were famous for all over Europe. for providing, you know, there's that book Cod. Have any of you read that book Cod? What a great thing that is. Same author that wrote that book Salt. They're both great books. Anyway, they decided to build, after a bit of time, they decided they would start building this big fort here. They decided unwisely to build it from masonry, you know, from stone rather than earth, to make it serious. And it was costing a huge amount. They had to bring the stone in and they had to bring the masons in to build it. In fact, Louis, after whom it's named, I think the 14th, was heard to comment that he expected to see it rising up over the horizon from his Versailles palace. It was going to be so big and high, he thought. So it had a lot of difficulty during constructions, but it took a long time to build. And, you know, the stone kept, because of the cold there, it's very cold, kept splitting and things like that, wouldn't set properly and so on. But by the 10 years later, 15 years later, it was a very bustling place. It wasn't so much just a fort. It was chosen, the locality was chosen more for the fishermen to be able to use it as the fishing port and to dry the fish and trade the fish and put the fish into barrels and all these sort of things. But also it became a transshipment point, so that ocean-going vessels would bring their cargo, leave it there, and then it would be transshipped onto smaller vessels to take it into Quebec City and to Montreal and so on. Furs and things coming out from the St. Lawrence would be brought there and transshipped onto vessels going back again, so that you didn't have to take the bigger ships up the seaway. And, you know, so it had lots of accommodation and restaurants and good life. You know, it was quite a bustling place there for a while. Why do we know all this? Partly because of a MacLennan. I don't know if you know this fella. You know, we had G.S. MacLennan, the great piper. Well, here you've got J.S., the senator for Cape Breton, Canadian Senate member eventually. His family were he was third generation Canadian. You'll find him in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. See down there, I've got this picture out of that thing. A Montreal family. His father had made money in transport. Now I take that to mean more like grain transport than running buses and, you know, carting passengers around. Transport. And the father had partial investment in a mine, a coal mine near Sydney, and he sent young John to manage the mine. And while he was there, he became entranced by the very small amount that was left after the British had demolished Louisbourg. You know, there were just like flat ruins. They'd sent Pitt had sent in explosive experts to try and wipe it from the map, this former glory of the French Empire. And this John would walk, in his spare time, would walk around the site and take with him his family and so on, and eventually became so obsessed with it that he gave up the mine job and went to France and you know, researched documents there, and went to Britain and researched documents to rediscover the history of this, what was just a slight ruin left there. He became a newspaper proprietor and senator. And this down here, this address, K. MacLennan, that's his daughter, Catherine with a K. You can go there and see a lot of stuff about Louisbourg itself, that Catherine became the curator of this museum that you see here. And if you go there today, the only building that's not in period style, built as in 1744, is the MacLennan House, which is part of the museum complex. Did you see that, George? He's gone. I can't see him. Do you know that? You've been there? This is my photo. I took it from the terrace of the Governor General's residence on the top of the Citadel at Quebec City, right? I just happened to turn up there. It wasn't planned. I was just walking around the place and they said, oh, you're here at 5 to 12. At 12 o'clock, we have an open day and we have waiters with champagne on silver trays. Should you like to join us? Come right in. So we did. And I was up there on the terrace on this lovely day and took this photo looking down the seaway. But this is the top of the citadel, so it becomes a big part. But really, you got to know that only by conquering, sieging and conquering the Louisbourg fort did they have a chance then to control the seaway. And of course, much as this gets all the glory, Plains of Abraham and the conquest of the citadel and so on, and unless they had conquered, sieged and conquered Louisbourg first, then they wouldn't have had a chance to do this. Now, because it's very steep on the front of the, a lot of you have seen the citadel at Quebec City, I'm sure. But the Plains of Abraham battle was actually on the field there on the inland side, you might say. Abraham was the name of the farmer who owned it. It was his first name, not his surname.
Abraham Martin.
Yeah, that's it, Abraham.
He's my 11th great-grandfather.
Hooray! Who's speaking?
Also the, where Mr. Wolfe was killed.
That's it. And
Yeah.
so this is the famous picture of Wolfe. Now, don't forget, Wolfe is the fella who was at Culloden, remember? They're making the connections here. And the other thing that's really notable about this is that Cook, that's James Cook, the great mariner who, charted the east coast of Australia, charted the coastline of New Zealand for the first time ever, but in both cases. Cook spent 7 years, somebody said yesterday, I know it was a long time, charting the St. Lawrence Seaway. He practiced his skill there in St. Lawrence that he later was very instrumental in the whole navigation, the whole migration story. Right there, while they were involved in this battle. So let's go back a step or two though. Before we had the siege of Louisbourg, we had the British soldier called George Washington, Virginia boy, being highly embarrassed. He went up to the forks of the Ohio, is that what it's called? Yeah, where Pittsburgh is today. He was adventuring up in that direction to try and, as a British soldier, George went to try and establish, to recce, really. He was asked to go and find out what the French were up to, and they were building a fort at Pittsburgh. This wasn't it. Fort Necessity is a little bit further back and was a temporary thing that George created on his retreat. And he got conned by the French into signing something after his First Nations people had put their axes through several Frenchmen's heads, into saying that he was totally responsible and he'd made a mistake and he shouldn't have done what he did and whatever, But it was all in French and he rushed to find an escape. Young George was very ambitious. He wanted to be, this story about how he wanted to be like his big brother, his half brother, Lawrence, wanted to be a commissioned officer in the British Army. And he wanted, because Lawrence had a warrant signed by the king himself. He thought that was a wonderful thing. And I was prompted when I did some research on Washington's background to read this. Can you see the cover? Closer, further away? I can't see what you can see. Anyway, it's called The Adventures of Roderick Random, and it was written by a fellow from a rather aristocratic Scottish family in this period, the mid-1700s. And it talks about his life as an assistant ship surgeon and as a soldier. But he was engaged in some of the Caribbean, in one of the same battles as George Washington's older brother, Lawrence, was engaged in. So I read it to try and understand a bit more about the period. It's a very good, interesting book. The Adventures of Roderick Random, it's called. Anyway, that's a bit, I'm getting off the subject. Washington was greatly embarrassed by what he did there and really he started the French and Indian Wars, which became the 7-Year War in Europe. He was fired the first shot, you might say. And this is what kicked off these wars that eventually gave New France to Britain. Very expensive, costly. So you had the siege and capture of Louisbourg, which gave them control of the seaway. Then a year later, you've got the siege and battle of the Quebec citadel, including Abraham Martin. And eventually, after the war went on to be fought in Europe as well, the Treaty of Paris ceded New France to Britain. The French are said to have thought that their colonies in the Caribbean that produced so much sugar that they all loved to have and was very profitable, were more precious to them than some wastelands in North America, as they thought. And so the aftermath of that is, of course, you've got the Townshend, the Stamps Act, and then being repealed, and then the Townshend Acts. And this fellow Townshend, you know, that's Tommy Townshend, the Lord Sydney. And it's, of course, this Townshend who gives the name Sydney to the place in Nova Scotia, where the coal mining and so on is, Sydney, Nova Scotia, and to Sydney, New South Wales, Tommy Townshend. And, you know, then you have the tea smugglers creating people, making people act like First Nation people to go and tip some tea off some ships in Boston Harbour. It's all a terrible saga. And within a year or two, you've got the Continental Congress and you've got Washington being asked to take over the Continental Army, and so it goes on, the 13 colonies rebelling. But, you know, here, going back to the citadel itself, this is the famous picture of Wolfe dying at the citadel. And look, he's got this fella here, like as if to say, us First Nations people, we're all for this British invasion. It's going to be great when you come. Here I am worshipping at your feet. Isn't that what that says? This is more propaganda, right? I should put another thing over that. Fake news. Wolfe, the fellow who told his men to shoot the Highlanders at the Battle of Culloden. So when you see that picture, you'll think of the historic links. Here's the deputy, the fellow who took over when Wolfe, you know, fell off the perch there. The fellow who took over was a Scot, James Murray, born in Scotland in 1721, took over command at the Plains of Abraham. He was in charge of these people called the Fraser's Highlanders, who'd been raised not that long earlier in Scotland, obviously, the 78th. Some of whom were like from aristocratic background, and they'd done their education in France and were Catholic, some of them. They spoke French often. Some, after the battles, settled there in what we call Lower Canada at that time, and some on PEI, Ile Saint-Jean. Then after he'd taken command of the forces, he then was appointed as the governor of Lower Canada, and the Quebecois. Would you say Quebecois or Quebecers? Come on, talk to me here.
We say Quebecois.
You say Quebecois.
Yeah,
And,
Quebecois.
And if you
that's the French. That's
Yeah, I
the
know.
French pronunciation.
But I'm wondering if but there is a word Quebecers, sometimes spelled with a K as well, isn't there?
No,
More colloquial, no?
that's the way the English people in Quebec say it. But otherwise, it's Quebecois.
Yeah, that's what I say too. Anyway, I got that because I read somewhere that this is more the word used in North America. English speakers.
Exactly.
I'll go back to my first word, Quebecois. And of course, you know, the point is that this fellow Murray, James Murray, was instrumental in allowing the French speakers to keep their way of life, you know, keep their Catholic religion, keep their French language, keep their cultural norms. And, you know, this goes back to the fact that he had people like that in his troops. Scotland had this long thing of the old alliance between France and Scotland, the common enemy. England made them allies. And really, of course, this becomes very important in the War of 1812 and so on, when, you know, the US are expecting the French to rise up against their overlords, but they say, no, 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 we're quite happy, thank you very much. It's more or less the story. So once the British had taken control of the New France, a lot of Scots moved into the Lower Canada, and on a lot of it was they made their money in lumber. That was a big part of it, lumber. They settled on the south side, a lot of them, you know, out there near where the border, where the border goes in a due east direction, and you've got New York and New Hanover and so on down there, just under that. But this is in what we call Canada today. So the eastern townships, it's called. So there were a lot settled down there. There's even a place called Scottstown, which has almost no Scots living in it today. But in those days, there were a lot of Scots in what we call Lower Canada who've since moved on, but you know, that was their culture. And they were very, the more I read about that period, the more I understand that they were very compatible with each other. They quite liked each other and did things together. And you know, you didn't quite have French folk playing bagpipes, but you know, they would join in each other's things, and French families would sing Scottish-based songs and, you know, this sort of stuff. There's a wonderful book about that. That's this book here. By, some of you read this book? Someone's got a microphone on. If you want to speak, put it on, but otherwise, can you keep it off? It's a great book. It's in the list. It's called Écossaise. And it's by this woman, Campey, C-A-M-P-E-Y. But it's on your list in the joining instructions. So that's down there. You see, there's the name at the bottom. Écossaise. I suppose you could say Ecosas, huh? No. Now let's just have a think then about these people who'd gone there to fight in these wars. And this, I think this is the uniform of Fraser's Highlanders here, and of course it's meant to show them climbing up the face of the citadel. I don't know quite what that is over in the background there, but that's sort of the point of this picture, that they were in these Scottish-looking gear climbing up this steep bank, and that would be what it was about. So where did they come from? Well, you know, I guess they were Scots, weren't they? Probably Highlanders, probably people who'd come from these sort of places we're talking about, where life was tough and population was increasing, and they were crowding into more and more of the same house and so on. But then they'd go off in their soldiering and see all these parts. Imagine somebody from, say, Lewis. You know, Lewis has just peat marshes, hardly a tree anywhere. And they come up the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they're just like in New Brunswick there. You've got these enormous forests of huge trees by comparison with, there's no way that it would have been a totally foreign world to these people who'd come from Lewis, just for example, and many other places. So they would have seen some of the world. Of course, they would have learnt some English because they'd come from Gaelic speaking parts where no English was spoken. Maybe one person or two in the whole parish could speak English. And they'd learn some English, so they'd be a bit more available to move places with more language. What did they do when they were discharged? I don't know, anybody want to contribute to this discussion? Well, some of them stayed, didn't they? This one here, this fellow Alexander, is somebody I know about who went to Canada as a soldier from Loch Broom, just near where Rory was christened, only 200 metres from where Rory was christened, where he lived. He went there in probably not the War of 1812, but just maybe a few years later, and stayed, married a lass and stayed on, settled, died in Simcoe. Innisfail is a place there in Simcoe County in Western Ontario.
Many of the soldiers, Bruce, were given, were encouraged from Scotland and Ireland, both. They were considered more disposable by the French, so they didn't mind leaving them in places where they had to maintain control or where they could be pretty risky. So they would be offered land, and depending on their rank, some of it was quite considerable, and they would take that in exchange for pay, because the British didn't have an abundance of funds to pay for these soldiers. So they would offer them land, free land grants into these areas, but it served their purposes because it left people who had sworn allegiance to the Americans and keep peace and order in the new communities.
Yeah, right. So, you know, it's a good deal for all concerned. And so many of them, this is the first part. Really, the point of this slide is that this is the beginning of the way migration started. Soldiers being sent off to these places, becoming a bit to like the place where they were. They could see opportunities. Where they'd come from was not that attractive to go back to. And they would stay on, or they might even go home and then return, you know, get married and come back and this sort of thing, yeah? So in a way, this is like the first wave of migration before you start having civilians coming in their own right, where people going there and settling. And quite a lot of these Fraser's Highlanders did indeed settle in Lower Canada and in the Maritimes. That's what they did after they... And then they started to tell their families back home, hey, it's pretty good over here. Lots of lumber to be had and we need more workers, and, you know, we've got some places you could live in. If you only send your kids over, that'd be great. And why don't you come yourself? And, you know, this sort of chain migration, they call it. Let's look at the US now. So we talked a bit about how people went to the Carolinas. Let's think about that in a little bit more detail. In particular, they went to this part here just up from Wilmington called Cape Fear. Now, Cape Fear, for those that don't know it, it's not a cape. It's not a cape that we're talking about here. It's actually the river, the Cape Fear River, and there is a cape, but you know, the Cape Fear River, and it's the valley of the Cape Fear River that we're talking about, where they settled. So there's a paper there that I don't think I gave you a link. I gave you a link to it. It's a paper I wrote way back, you know, nearly 10 years ago. To do with another interest of mine, the American Civil War, where I talked about Scots, you know, because this is what Simon and Garfunkel called the cradle of the Civil War, isn't it? How's the tune go? Come on, somebody can hum a few bars. The Cape Fear. Anyway, one of the people who went there to the Cape Fear after Culloden was Flora MacDonald. Who's she? Come on, somebody. You all know who Flora MacDonald is. Come on. Tell me.
She aided Bonnie Prince Charles' escape.
Correct. She married a MacDonald, as you might expect, so he didn't change his surname. That was handy. And she and her husband went to settle in the Cape Fear Valley. And he was in this little battle that's mentioned here, Moore's Creek Bridge Battle of 1776. It was one of the wars of the American Revolution. He had raised a bunch of loyalists. That's really weird in a way, isn't it? That these people who'd been so anti-monarchy when Culloden was on were now staunch loyalists. We're going to hear a bit more about them. That's the term that's used, United Empire Loyalists and all that sort of name. And you can see here this map that I got. You know, these are not the colonies from that time, are they? Because you've got Maine there and you've got various other, I think West Virginia, you see, that didn't come along till many years later. But nonetheless, you've got this place here, inland from Wilmington, a lot of Scots going directly to there to settle. Including Flora MacDonald and her husband. And after the Revolutionary War, these people who'd gone there go off, some back to Scotland, but also some to Nova Scotia. We'll see later, quite a lot went back to Nova Scotia. The other group that I want to mention specifically are these people upstate New York, you know, just near the Catskills there in the Mohawk Valley. And you've got there William Johnson with quite a big settlement in that part, who moved after the Revolutionary War, moved up to what we call Ontario today, well, on the border really between, not far west of Montreal, usually around there. So the point to make is that this migration in the 1770s was long before the much maligned clearances. This is long before there were sheep and lairds sending people off. These were people going totally of their own choice because they wanted a better life to go somewhere else. And that's it. After the rebellion in America, many returned or went to Nova Scotia. Let's look at a particular case so we know a little bit more about this. You know, you probably all have heard that there's a county in Texas called MacLennan County. Nod if you agree. MacLennan County, Waco's its seat. You know, bush territory down there, isn't it? So this fellow, Neil MacLennan, his mother and his invalid mother and his two brothers, Lachlan and John, left Skye in 1801. So just a little bit after the 1770s, but this is a similar exercise. They're doing it for their own choice there. And they went to live up here in upstate North Carolina. It's really in that part we just saw in that previous slide, right? It's not actually, where they went isn't actually on the Cape Fear River itself, but it's within that area that we saw the picture of there a minute ago. And then after many years there, like nearly 20 years, they moved around to the panhandle of Florida, just west of Tallahassee. And and I had previously thought they sailed around there between you and me. But when I was reading up for this talk, I didn't really read that they had sailed there, but they might have. They talk about them going to Florida somehow in this period. Anyway, so about 1820, they're living here in the panhandle just east of Pensacola. And this is the place name. And then they stay there for quite a while and they move on in 1835. Some say they built their own boat, others say they bought a boat. They sailed themselves across the mouth of the Mississippi to the Brazos River and immediately sailed that boat up the Brazos and settled at a place called MacLennan's Bluff, which is roughly around this, you know, just south of Waco, in other words. I had to fit all this text in so you could read it. And it's there that they spend a few years and they're attacked by Native Americans. Is that the politically correct word to use? That'll do. Native Americans who kill the invalid mother and kill one of his brothers in the attack. So they up stakes from there. They think it's too dangerous. And they move across here to the river itself, a place called Nashville on Brazos, that where they live. And again, they're subject to a Native American attack. And another brother is killed in the attack. And they move up to just to the very alongside Waco itself in 1845. So this is the story of Neil, often called Neil Love MacLennan, and you'll see lots of monuments and so on to him in Waco. Of course, don't forget they're coming here to Texas long before Texas was a state. Of course, as we all know, it became a republic first and then joined the other states in due course. But this is even before the Alamo, which, as we know, was not a win for the settlers. Santa Ana had the day, and so you know they were there even before the Alamo. I have a funny story. I took my boys to the Alamo, and they had those baseball caps. You know, such an American thing to us, baseball caps. They had baseball caps on, and some guard came over. boys, in this sacred place, could you please take off your baseball caps? I thought it was a lot of freedoms. Freedom's one thing, huh? I shouldn't joke about freedom. You're not free to wear a baseball cap, though, in the Alamo. Oh, dear. Okay, now if you go to the US website, you'll see that on the banner of the US website, there's a picture that I found in a post office in a place called Mart in Texas, of Neil arriving on the Texas plains, covered in grain and so on, with his covered wagon, and we modified it a bit because the actual mural had a couple of doors in it. It was just on a wall, but the wall had doors, so they just painted the mural around the doors. So we made up the bit where the doors were that you see on the clan website US page, US site. Let's go back now. You okay with this jumping around? I know I'm jumping around a bit from one part of the world to the other, but I've covered the... Oh, what's that music in the background there? What sort of music was that? Did you hear it? I'll go back, you can hear it again. Anybody who's asleep, what's happening?
It's Cajun.
That's Cajun music.
Cajun.
That's what you hear. Ah, we love that. When you're down in the Mississippi, down in Louisiana, you hear in the bayous.
Somebody from New Orleans is on the line.
Come in playing the squeeze box and the fiddle and dancing. It's a famous thing, isn't it? There's a lot of jumping about associated with Cajun music. Anyway, so these people, that you see down there in the bayous of Louisiana, what are they called? Albertville and names like that. The places down there, the bayous. They were people who got evicted by the British from Nova Scotia, as we call, including Ile Saint-Jean, but in particular, these were people before the Plains of Abraham being evicted. About 10,000 of them were sent packing. Not all to the bayous. Some went there. Of course, it was French speaking, and that was a good place to go out from New Orleans. But some went back to France and others to the islands in the Atlantic and so on. And the ones who settled in the Louisiana swamps there changed from being called Acadians to being called Cajuns. And they'll have lovely food, don't they? Jumbo and all that. So in 1763, after the French and Indian Wars and the 7 Years' War, there's a settlement and New France becomes part of Britain. The whole thing, of course, this is the big thing, the basis of migration, right? That people can go there. PEI itself, which is still called St. John's Island in the English for some time, is divided up into a small number of properties owned by proprietors, who then in turn rented it out in bits and pieces. And we have about 8,000 hectares. Now, some of you don't know the new money term. I think that's 20,000 acres. Quite big lots, in other words. So there were a handful of private proprietors who owned the whole island. And, it's a bit of an aspiration of most migrants that they can own their own land. That's a sort of like a motivating factor in migrating, that we don't live in a sort of feudal world like they had in Scotland, where you're answerable to your landlord, but we live in on a patch of land that we own ourselves. And they couldn't do that on PEI. So some of them went on to live in Cape Breton and so on, where they could get their own land in much smaller proportions, quantities. The biggest group of these people who went there to settle PEI after this land was divided up were the Selkirk settlers in 1803. And Selkirk, you might remember, is a name that you hear more associated with the Red River settlements at, Winnipeg, as we now call it, but what was then known as Red River settlement. In fact, he rather hurriedly bought this land in PEI because he had promised people, I think mainly from Uist in the Hebrides, and maybe some others like Skye or somewhere, that they would be taken off out of their poverty to the new lands he was promising them Red River, but he was unable to deliver and when the people were ready to go. So he hurriedly bought this land on PEI and settled them there, the biggest group to go there in one bunch, the Selkirk settlement it's called. And by the mid-1800s, you had half of the population of PEI of Scottish extraction. A lot of MacLennans were there. You know, you go to the as I've done, to the archives there, it's terrific. A lot of MacLennans, I've got every card, Melanie. I took a photo of every of the, you know, they have these trays of cards. Every MacLennan card I've got a photo of from the archive at Charlottetown. I'm not sure I want to deal with it yet. Oh, okay, we'll deal with it. Yeah, let's deal with this now. I thought I had another one there. I'll come back to PEI shortly, but let's talk. We're talking about those settlements, those people that came out of the US and into settling in Canada. And we have those, you remember we saw those people in the Mohawk Valley, the Johnsons? They moved, and under their auspices brought a lot of their followers. They had these land there in upstate New York near the Catskills, and the son went off. Sir John Johnson went off and formed this King's Royal Regiment of New York as a loyalist. Really, in the process, lost all that land and became a leader in re-establishing those loyalists in what is now Ontario. Just right as, and often up there close to Montreal, to the Ottawa River. About 10,000 loyalists came from the US to settle in what is now called Quebec, including those eastern townships I mentioned before, and modern day Ontario. Upper. This house, I might add, was owned by, you know, it's a historic museum today, but for a time it was owned by a MacLennan who was the Laird of Glengarry, Williamstown. Murdoch, is it Melanie? I think Murdoch, MacLennan. Anyway, we've got him there. And then this is the Williamstown Church, the famous St Andrew's Stone Church, as it's often called. And this is a statue, quite a modern statue, 1988. My photo taken. It's not quite that big in real life. I just took it up close. But, you know, it's meant to show the loyalists seeking sanctuary and arriving at this wonderful location there at Glengarry. So just take a note of the look of that. And the next photo I want you to see, this is this photo. See, it's right alongside this one. You've got this headstone on the other side of the path, which is to this MacLennan family, a famous family. And this is Big Rory. Everybody knows Big Rory. We're all familiar with him. He's this ID number, 60434. This is him here. Nobody knows really what the R means. Well, his siblings have got an R in the middle, but you'd assume it's the Roderick of his father's name, right? But when you're called Roderick and you've got an R in the middle name, do you know, Melanie, what his middle name is? I don't know.
I don't know, but I could probably look it up. Could it possibly be his mother's maiden name?
Maybe, but the other siblings have got R, and I think it means Roderick the father. Nobody ever writes it anywhere. I've never seen it written, a middle name.
There's traditions over here with different communities, Mennonites being one, that you'll often see all the children with a common middle name, and it's usually the mother's maiden name or a name that's been passed down. My own son-in-law, all 7 children have the middle name of Kendall, and it traces back to about 300 years ago to Ireland, and it was a family that lived near them for whatever reason. Yeah.
So he's quite a guy, this fellow, Big Rory. You know, apparently he's called that because he was quite a sportsman in his youth, you know, a runner and a weightlifter and whatever. And later became not just a lieutenant colonel, I think that's more an honorary title. His big thing was that he became a railway construction proprietor. You know, he built railways in the time of railway building all over North America, including a very difficult section of the transcontinental railway in Canada, and that made him very rich. Very rich. In fact, he died unmarried. He left his fortune to a fellow, a nephew, who'd been building railway. When I found him, he was building railways in Chile, from Santiago to Valparaiso. The picture, yeah.
You said the birthstone or the tombstone said he has a wife and children.
No, that's the top fella. That's Roderick. That one. I'm talking about this one here. Their son.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So this is the parents, and this is the son here. This is this one. Lieutenant Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel. See, 42 to 07, 42. That's just he was Member of Parliament from 91 to 06. But this is his dates, 42 to 07. Unmarried, yeah. That's why he's here with his parents, because he doesn't have a wife. And it's the same church. There are heaps of MacLennans in this churchyard. Heaps. It's a good thing. Don't worry about it. It's a good thing. Let's jump back to PEI now and the maritime.
Bruce, could I, before you leave, may I ask a question about
Of course.
Glengarry, Ontario versus Kincardine, I had to make notes, and Bruce and Huron counties? There seems to be a lot of money. I mean, I look at the church here versus my family's church in Bruce County, and my research, is there a large difference of wealth, or is it my perception?
Well, you know, if you go back to these houses here, the one we looked at a minute ago, this one, and the other one there that's called Bethune-Thompson House, the other museum in Williamstown. These are the three big places to go there. The Thompson name is someone who was a Nor'wester. You know, he made a fortune being a Nor'wester. And you've got this big Rory being the railway king, you know, making a huge amount of money in railways. No, I think it's just that it wasn't really the locality or any, you know, crops.
Well, I didn't know that maybe they're coming from Scotland. I mean, whether there was a different flavor, a different culture. Industrial sense.
Well, they had proximity to Montreal. Very, you know, Montreal's not. You could be a Nor'wester and live in Williamstown because you know it's not that far, just over the Ottawa River, and you're there.
Thank you.
You know what I mean? You'd probably paddle your own canoe down there, could you? At least going one way. Get someone else to carry it back for you. So it could be that. It could be the proximity, you know, to be a Nor'wester, not being. And they actually held some of the meetings of the Nor'westers in Williamstown, you know. Not, you think of it as a Montreal company. Montreal. So coming back to the Maritimes, so these in the 1770s, we have people we've seen going, someone's got their mic on, Barbara, John?
Yeah.
Thanks. You have people choosing to go, to leave Scotland, not being forced out by anybody, but choosing to go. So one of those is the famous Hector. I got to admit, this is not my photo. My photo, when I saw it, the ship was rather rotten and falling apart. Had bits taken off it for repair. And so I used someone else's photo here. I have a very similar one. In fact, you know, the Hector Centre has a MacLennan banner, quite a big banner on the road just opposite there, because 3 MacLennans arrived on this ship. That name later morphed into being McClellan, you know that? But it was, for many decades, it was written as MacLennan Mountain, changed to McClellan Mountain later on, after several generations. And we had, look at this. We saw there were 10,000 Loyalists went to Glengarry and other parts around there. But look at this, 35,000 Loyalists in the Maritimes after the American Rebellion. the 13 colonies. And they're sending word back, all these people, saying it's pretty cool over here, folks. Come and join us. You know, there's lumber to be had and the like. All these places where they came from. Don't forget Applecross, Barbara. Is that right? Don't forget Applecross. This is a map in 1806, the sort of time we're getting up to now, of, you know, by that time you've got New France no longer being there. You've got lower Canada there, lower, and you've got upper, you see through there, Canada marked. You've got these maritimes out here, you know, PEI, Cape Breton. And there was a time, at this time, Cape Breton, you know, was a separate colony. This was Nova Scotia and this was Cape Breton. They were separate places for about 20 or 30 years. There's a wonderful book that I bought in Cape Breton. Rise Again, Cape Breton. You know, make it a separate state, a province again. You know, their independence, they value a great deal. They rue the day that a bridge was put across between, in that little strait in there, because we lost our independence when the bridge, we were joined to the mainland forever. And of course, you've got the bridge now across from PEI to New Brunswick there, 13-kilometre bridge, amazing thing. So this is it. So you got, this is part of the Hudson Bay here itself. The thing I find most interesting about this map in 1806, no suggestion of Toronto anywhere. You've got Quebec City and you've got Montreal, of course. You've got the Ottawa River. But the main things marked on here are Indian tribes. You see that? See, look at these, all these names here. They're all names of Native American tribes, to be politically correct. Interesting, isn't it? And this, these are what I was talking about, eastern townships here and there. So just focusing in a little bit more on Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. This is where the first French settlement was, over this side in the Bay of Fundy. And then you've got Halifax here, and you've got the Canso Strait through between Cape Breton. You see how much waterway there is there. And, you know, this is very suitable for fishing. And you've got Ile Saint-Jean marked still on that map, the 1806, a long time after the Plains of Abraham. The English on their maps are still calling this thing Ile Saint-Jean, not PEI at that stage. This is my photo of Cape Breton, taken on the sort of, well, looking at where we were. This is taken just north of Inverness town up here. So you can see how it's not very suitable for just moving from one part to another unless you've got, you know, it's got these pockets, places where pockets. So it reminds me of Yugoslavia, you know, where this can be one pocket. And so the point of this, showing you this photo, is that you had these communities, separate pockets, Gaelic-speaking Catholics, Gaelic-speaking Presbyterians, some French-speaking people who hadn't been evicted in the evictions earlier, particularly there, the First Nations people from there. You had Loyalists, so many had arrived from, you know, elsewhere, and you also had an Irish group, all doing their own sort of trades, you know, coal around Sydney, shipbuilding in some parts, timber and fishing, of course, is a big, all different activities. But in these pockets, so when you're trying to understand your relatives in Cape Breton, you need to think of, were they Catholics, were they Protestants, or were they Gaelic speakers? And often people seem to go there Gaelic speaking, and then they would move on to elsewhere after they'd learnt some English and the like. And particularly many went to Boston from here. It's quite close, of course. If you go back to the map, you know how close it is. I don't need to tell you. Went from here to Boston to be involved in shoemaking and those sort of industries they had in Boston. I want to just show you we saw that picture a few minutes ago of how hilly and these pockets are around the coast of Cape Breton. The whole thing is like that. Not very many flat-ish areas to grow grains and to really be part of a broader community. Whereas, you know, we talked about how PEI was divided up into these 67 to 20,000 acre blocks. And even from this map, this distance, without being too specific, you can just sort of start to see how flat this is and how it's a beautiful place. I've always said, if anybody knows anybody who wants to do a house swap with a big house in Sydney, just let me know. I'd go there anytime for 3 months, for 6 months. It's such a lovely place, PEI. Hey, anybody know anybody? Send me an email. Somebody might live there, might want to do a swap. There's just an announcement, an advertising announcement here. So looking now, you saw Charlottetown there, there's where it is on the map. And then if we move on to this little corner down here below Charlottetown, this is where the Selkirk settlers were in here. It's a great book. If you have a chance to read that, that book, the Dance Called America, this talks about this whole, he went broke really, trying to help the plight of Highlanders, particularly from Sutherland, yeah, from over on the east coast of northeast of the well north of the Black Isle.
Yeah, Bruce, does Belfast have a lot of records about the?
Well, in the Charlottetown records, you can find a lot of Belfast people, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about their minister shortly, Barbara. So he rushed to buy this land because I said earlier, he'd promised to send them to the wonderful Red River settlement, Winnipeg. But in fact, he had to go and buy this to satisfy their need. And three ships left in 1803, mostly from Skye and Uist. This Reverend John MacLennan went there as one of the first Presbyterian ministers in Canada, number 1433 to you in the database. And he became the first Presbyterian minister to these Scots who were in this biggest group of people to go to PEI. This is my photo of his memorial. He died in Scotland, actually. He went back and is in the 1851 census in Scotland with his family. That was lucky. This is my photo, though, of his memorial in this little fence with some of his other family around. And that's the wording of that. I've transcribed it there. The first pastor of this congregation being settled in 1823, and for 36 years, amidst many trials and difficulties, laboured unwearied in his master's service. Nice, huh? His wife returned to Charlottetown, and there's a place called MacLennan House, in rather bad repair, I've got to say, in the middle of town. If you go and look at the clan database, you'll see a picture of the house, MacLennan House, where Catherine, his beloved wife, lived on for many years after he died. In part answer to your question, Barbara, the records, he travelled a lot, as ministers often did. He travelled around to New Brunswick, to Cape Breton particularly, where there were no ministers, to Newfoundland sometimes, and he baptised and married people on those travels. And so sometimes you'll see people being, their record of marriage being in St. John's, it's called, parish, PEI, and you think, oh, what were they doing getting married there? Well, actually, they weren't there getting married. They were being married by the minister from there and put into his register of marriages because that was the only one available. That makes sense? So they're not really there at all. It's quite common, and you see his signature, this John MacLennan, on lots of people's marriages and baptisms. John MacLennan. I won't deal with it any further, but you know, on the Canadian website, there's this paper I wrote some time ago about, I just put it in paper, the mainly westward expansion by Scots, including MacLennans, including a MacLennan who got a reward for the discovering the Franklin ship, you know, on the search for the Northwest Passage. That's just there to go and have a look at if you want to expand that interest in that. This is the Athabasca here, river, of course, and the west. Now, just coming back to what was driving people away from Scotland for a while. On the islands in the Hebrides there, both the inland and the others, but mainly on the Harris, Lewis and Harris, particularly on the inland side of, meaning the side closest to the Scottish mainland, you had this seaweed, kelp, being, you know, all sorts of seaweed. This is the one that just grows on the rocks on the shore. These are the ones that are a bit deeper out, different kinds. And they had this thing called kelping. And kelping meant getting the seaweed, dragging it up to the shore and burning it. And I gather it reduced down to some sort of lump. And it was quite backbreaking work with a lot of stirring of the kelp while it was burning and adding more kelp and doing it through the night. You know, you couldn't just go to bed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You had to be there all night stirring, backbreaking work in these. And you can still see traces of these kilns that were on these islands. It began to take over from their traditional sources of income, this potash, which is used for soap and glass manufacturing. As I said, it grew and grew such that it replaced the black cattle farming that had been the staple source of income for islanders for centuries, and also replaced the unreliable. Some years the herrings wouldn't arrive on schedule. They didn't know, couldn't read their watches or something, and wouldn't turn up, and so they'd be impoverished for that year because the herrings hadn't arrived. Whereas the kelp was always there and they could keep farming it. The bad thing was that it was not just hard work, but it was done during the summer months when they should have been looking after their crops. In earlier years, they'd used kelp as a fertilizer and dug it into the ground before they planted their crops. And that, of course, fell by the wayside as well. So it meant their crops were not only neglected, but not as well fertilized as they had been. And this, of course, meant, you know, difficulties, that their diet was no longer as good as it had been. It became, by the late 1700s, it became the main source of income for the islands. The price, fortunately for them, the price rose dramatically during the Napoleonic Wars because the sources from other countries were cut off. I think Spain was the other source, although some are said to have come, quite a bit, to have come from the St. Lawrence Seaway, but it was cut off anyway, and the price rose accordingly. But then, with Waterloo having come and gone, the price collapsed. The tariffs on importing salt ash, potash from elsewhere were removed, and the poverty set in. So, really, people were in desperate straits there in those years, the 1820s, that sort of period. And this is when you get a lot of migration to Canada because of the sheer poverty, to Nova Scotia. Because they're Gaelic speakers, it suits them better to go to Nova Scotia, some to Red River and other parts, PEI and New Brunswick. Then 10 years or so after that, 20 years later, you have the potato blight. You remember we saw how the potato had come from Peru in the mid-1700s, and now by the that should say 1700s, it was adopted, not 700s. Typo. The potato blight arrived. Of course, we know it arrived in a huge way in Ireland. Everybody talks about the potato blight, potato famine in Ireland, where 1 million people died and 2 million people emigrated. A huge deal for Ireland. The same thing happened in Scotland to an extent, although it was about a year later and they had better ideas about how to alleviate the difficulty by charitable institutions. But generally in Scotland, there's this feeling that you shouldn't be the recipient of, it's not good for you to get free handouts. You should do something for your handouts. It's generally a thing. They don't do it lightly. And so we had extreme poverty setting in, particularly in this early period in Skye and in the other islands of the Hebrides. Especially in the 1864, but it lingered on in different parts until 1856. And people were then, you know, just really in a dire strait. And landlords, you know, contrary to what you read, that landlords were all bastards and kicked people out unmercifully, landlords paid passages for 16,000 of their tenants to find better places to live in other parts of the world. James Matheson, you remember he's the guy, Jardine Matheson of Hong Kong, spent £33,000 just over 3 years only, supporting his tenants to have a better life. Late in this period, you have this thing called the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society, which Melanie might have some idea on this. I've understood that it covered migrations to Canada as well as to Australia. But when I came to look at the they recently added this to Scotland's People, this section here that deals with immigration records, and down here it's got this Highlands and Islands Immigration Society, which was a British thing set up to alleviate the poverty of people on the islands and generally in the Highlands. 5,000 people were covered by this, were helped by this group to emigrate in different sorts of ways over the period it evolved, how they did it, including 44 on that ship that we had the author talk about recently, Ticonderoga. But I understood that this society sponsored people to go to Canada, but if you look at the records on here, there don't seem to be any records of people going to Canada. They seem to be all going to Australia, all these people, on 31 voyages. And there aren't many MacLennans, actually. You know, we know that there were 800 people on the Ticonderoga from our talk, don't we? The Hell book, this one. We know that there were 800 people. What did I say? 800 people. And only 44 of them were sponsored by this group, so they weren't chartering the whole ship by any means. And only 44, you know, MacLennans of any spelling were on there. What I suggest you do, if you are interested in this, how it worked and how it evolved and different support they gave, that you go not to this link to actually go and find people, but to this link on Scotland's People that has a separate paper dealing with the scheme and how it worked and who was who and so on. But do you know, Melanie, if there are any people went to Canada from this scheme?
I've not come across that name, but it would be worth investigating to see if maybe some individuals got money, but I've never seen that here in Canadian records.
Right, okay.
But bears investigating.
It's beautifully written, I've got to say. The books are all neatly kept and they tell you who helped. You know, it coordinates the people wanting to leave, choosing them, trying to encourage families to go as groups, people with occupations that were needed, like shepherds and these sorts of things. People would suddenly become shepherds, is my impression. Someone who'd been a, you know, railway labourer suddenly became a shepherd for the purpose of immigrating. Yeah. Help them get sponsored. But,
I do have records, Bruce, of my great-grandfather being rejected for payment to go to support, thank you, support for going to Canada.
Right.
And the group and so forth that I'll pass on to you.
Single people, they generally did not encourage. They generally tried to encourage them to go as families. And even older children they didn't want, but of childbearing age, they wanted to send those if they could. So looking at, I'm just now coming towards the conclusion of our session here today. We're just going to do a couple on the migrations to Australia. I went last week to a show, just, you know, like in a suburb or two from where I live. They have a display of old maps, and I thought, my God, there's a map I can use in the session. And in the handout that they gave you when you came in the door, it said it was a map from 1744. So I thought that was pretty good, except that then when I actually read it on there, it says 1644, so never mind. But there wasn't actually a whole lot that happened between this map and the time that Cook of the St. Lawrence Seaway, Whitby Cook, he wasn't a Quaker himself, but you know, if you go to Whitby, you can see where he lived under the master who was a Quaker. It was a big Quaker centre, Cook. might have explained some of his sort of, you know, way of doing things. The fact that he was brought up under a Quaker. He lived in a Quaker household as an apprentice shipbuilder, or, you know, in shipping. Anyway, he went to Tahiti to observe the passing of the sun, and came on to navigate, to chart this part of the world. So there really wasn't a lot of difference between 1644 and 1770 when he came on his first voyage. Every Australian knows, you know, people just nod when you start talking about this, how there were what we call convicts sent to the American colonies, and the ability to send convicts to the American colonies dried up once the 13 states rebelled. And so they were held on hulks in the Thames and whatnot, in these old boats, building up and living in a terrible state. And they needed to find some other place to get rid of their convicts now that they could no longer send them to North America. Most North Americans don't know this story, and I have tried to investigate it. One thing to do is not to look for the word convicts, because that's not a word used in that context for people in North America. But quite large numbers were sent to the Chesapeake cotton tobacco growing areas over many years. Often they were in relatively, they weren't, you know, dragged around in chain gangs. They were more like domestic servants and people like that, who it was thought better not to keep them on in. But they were there for a period, like a felon would be. 7 years was the usual thing, just like the early indentured labourers who went to Jamestown. You know, it's a pretty easy thing once you know what you're looking for to find about these prisoners, is the word to use, that went to the American colonies right from the early days until the rebellion. The Act of 1717 made it easier to send prisoners from Britain to North America. So they built up in the Thames. Cook had been there. He charted all around New Zealand, made charts, and he then came across, charted all around the east coast of Australia and created the map there. And then not long after Cook, the first fleet, this amazing voyage of 20,000 kilometres, and with 1,500 people, 11 ships came, spent time in Rio on the way to this part of the world, and settled in Sydney. Don't forget that the second place they settled was Hobart, and the supplier to the settlement in Hobart, only weeks after it had been established, the second fleet, as they call it, from Sydney to Hobart, was the commander of that fleet was our Donald MacLennan from Dingwall, Captain Donald. This is the sort of ship that he went to Tahiti and brought pigs and turtles and things to Sydney when he came from Tahiti in 1803, and was commissioned, because a couple of the government ships had sunk or something. They commissioned him to be the commander of the fleet, the fleet of 2 vessels, I might add, to resupply the brand new, weeks old settlement of Hobart. So that's what he did in his boat, his ship, the Dart. And when he returned eventually to Scotland, he bought the old castle that had been there in just down from the famous church in Dingwall, and he pulled the stones from it, you know, pulled it apart, and built himself this house here, this mansion. Since I first took this photo, they put a high, like, very ordinary looking fence up, so you can't see it quite as well as you used to be able to, but it's just it's in Church Street in Dingwall. And you can read about it in the book Guide to MacLennan Places. That's a free ebook that you can get, those of you that haven't got it yet, from the left-hand menu on the Genealogy webpage. Guide MacLennan, Guide to Scotland Places, or something like that, the link is. Lower down on the left-hand side. So the Australian population was petering along here with these various people that are known as convicts, prisoners and released prisoners, it's fair to say. And then you have a bit of an increase from the 1830s onwards. And then what happens here about 1850 odd? 1851, 1852, what's happening? Any clues? What was discovered? Let me put it that way. Come on, microphone on.
Gold.
Gold, that's it. Yeah, look, it's almost vertical, the line there. And look at the population increase from almost nothing in the country in 1800. You've got a few, and you know, and then zoom, it goes up to 1900. And there it is, gold. Now look at this. Bear in mind that Melbourne was only settled in 1835, right? So by 1850, it's only 15 years old, half a generation. And there are just a handful of people there. Like, look how big Sydney and New South Wales is. Hugely different. By only 5 years later, the population of Victoria is now greater than the population of Sydney that had been established for almost, 80 years or something by that stage. Look, some have even gone, they've left New South Wales and gone to Melbourne. They've gone mad. Gold was first discovered in New South Wales, but it was in such huge quantities. I think Victoria supplied something like 2/3 of the world's gold supply in this period here we're talking about. And one of the biggest nugget ever discovered anywhere in the world, this one here, this is not this one, this is the second biggest. The Welcome Stranger was just on the ground, more or less. They didn't have to dig for it even. It was just sort of like under a tree, waiting for someone to pick it up. 97 kilos of gold. It's good, isn't it? So you can see here, this is a huge increase in population. Doubles again 5 years later. Boom, boom. People are just, sailors are coming in on ships and, leaving the ship, what do you call it? Abandoning ship and rushing inland to try and pick up their own bits of gold. All these stories keep coming. And if you read the Scottish newspapers, this is the point. And in this time, in the 1850s and 1860s, you go to a place in Scotland where they got the actual newspapers, you can read them. It'll have all these news items, gold discovered here, gold discovered there. And it went on for 50 years, gold being discovered in Australia, particularly till the gold in Western Australia, like inland from Perth. Vast, huge pits they are there now that have been, gold's been dug out of for 100 years. So you then had this fellow who's totally pivotal to the Scots arriving in Australia. He's called, he had a doctorate. He was called DD, Doctor of Divinity, and he was a minister of the church, the first Presbyterian minister on mainland Australia. There was one in Hobart just a year earlier. It's impossible to describe how much he did, how energetic, and he was not just a politician, an educator, an author, and a statesman. He was a journalist, and he was a, advocate, a ship organizer. It's just exhausting to read how much he did in his time. He came from out in the mouth of the Clyde, a place called Largs, down on the coast out from Glasgow. And he did, in 1831, he did speaking tours around the Highlands and advocated for the right type of settler to migrate to Australia, meaning people with skills like masons and artisans and so on, and people with industry prepared to work. He was mainly interested in bringing masons and the like at this 1831 trip on the first of the ships that he brought. They did a great deal to assess the migrants about their suitability to become a colonialist in Australia. And in fact, they on board formed this like a classroom thing to while away the hours of passing on geometry and algebra and so on to the others on the ship, these so-called mechanics, as they're called. And in fact, that became a thing called the Mechanics Institute, which still exists today. Prue went to a Zoom talk at the Mechanics Institute in Sydney, and is a member actually of that group. She got a membership of this, which was the result of the first ship ever of migrants brought to Australia by this fellow here at that time. And he was an advocate against the importation of prisoners, and Chinese. He was a great supporter of the Chinese, but he almost fell out with everybody. He argued, you know, he was such a bit of a self-promoter too, I think. That mightn't have helped his popularity with other folk, such that there were, in the one street in Sydney, the one where the Parliament House is, there were at one time 4 different branches of Presbyterianism, all with their own churches there. You know, there was like a bit like the People's Front of Judea, you know, in the what's it called, that movie? Oh no, I'm from the People's Front of Judea, I'm a Judea People's Front, you know, this sort of thing. There was the Eastern Australian Presbyterians and the Free Church of, you know, and so on, all these different branches, because they, you know, this fellow was so, what's the word? Powerful. His own church, the Scots Church as it's called, was near what is the approaches to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and had to be bowled over in the 1920s to make way for the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But there's still a Lang Park near there, and a church there, but it just moved a bit. He spoke to this guy. This guy heard him speak in Plockton, in Lockhouse Parish, and decided not to go to Canada. This guy took his wife and his 2 sisters, one of them married already, and they went. They hopped on this ship in 1837. So this is, you know, a period when not many free settlers are coming to Australia, before gold, in other words. That's my point. And he brought his wife, that's Mary Matheson from Lockhouse Parish, and his sister Catherine, who married when she got here, to this William Freeman, a freed convict, and his sister Christina, who went to Victoria, and she was married when she came on the ship. So between them, he had 13. This couple had 13 children. This couple had 7. This couple had 11. So it's a really big, you know, group that come out of that. This is the people who we know as the Grafton MacLennans. You know how they were the first clan association outside Scotland to be formed, were the Grafton MacLennans. Still exist today, and they're up north of Sydney, and this is the founder of it. In fact, he's a good case though, because his headstone has the wrong date for his death. Someone had chipped it in wrongly. It's only a year out, but still, this is what happens. Don't rely on headstones, is the moral in the story. Here's the you know, description of the boat coming in. I've got to say to you, this term immigrants worldwide was used. It implied that you were being sponsored to come, like people who were coming on a ship to come to some part of the world, Canada or whatever, coming first class, would not want themselves to be called immigrants, because it implied that you were somehow in an impoverished state having to go. So if you were like a colonial official going to a posting in somewhere, you wouldn't want to be known as an immigrant. That's the implication of that word. And you know, in Scotland, of course, they use the word immigrant. On the database, generally, I use the word migrated to Canada or whatever, because it means the same thing whether you're in Canada or in Scotland, right? But if you use the word immigrated to Canada or immigrated into Canada, it makes no sense. You see what I mean? The word gets a bit overused as well. I've tried not to use the word immigrate or emigrate, just migrate. The funny thing about this was that, you see, they arrived, and here's the arrival notice of the ship in the paper. They arrived on the 27th of October 1837, and only 2 days before that had the colony learnt that Queen Victoria had ascended to the crown back in June of that year. How long is that? Hey, there was no email in those days. No Zoom meetings to tell you the Queen's just taken the throne on. Look at the time between it. That's a long time. This is another group. This is really the main core of people in Victoria. Melanie will know Max, who was descended from these people. These 3 brothers, they came and they married 3 Innes sisters. And William, who came in 1861, had 10 children. Angus had 11 children. John had 10 children. So they form a really big part of the Victorian. They lived right up in the northwest of Victoria. This place, Manu, that's a place in Victoria. And these 3 brothers. And in due course, their sister and their mother came too to settle. And also their brother Duncan, who stayed on in Scotland, his children migrated to Victoria. So really, overall, this forms a big part of the clan in, in that part of the world. There are at least 10 histories in the clan records related to this family. Now let's just briefly think before we close about the ships that these people came on. This is a revolutionary ship designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And the youngest of those brothers we just looked at came on this ship to Australia. At first it was used in the Atlantic run. It was the biggest ship ever built at the time. It was the first ship ever to be built with what we would call an ordinary propeller, screw propeller, and to be built of steel. It made the crossing from Bristol. Brunel, of course, was closely associated with Bristol, a great place of tobacco, and he built the railway line called the Great Western Railway, and he built a ship called the Great Western, and also a ship called the Great Eastern. Anyway, this Great Britain, it was scuttled in the Falkland Islands and lay in the sea for many years, and it was refloated and brought back, and it is now has its own museum at Bristol. But in the meantime, this fellow John had gone on this, and he kept a diary, John of the Manu brothers. This is a picture of it being launched. Not sure where it was launched. It launched in 1843, you know, just a revolutionary ship. So you've got to start to think, well, at this point, the ships themselves are starting to get steam engines in them, screw propellers, not what do you call it, paddle wheels. And it also had auxiliary sail, and later it actually was converted to a full sailing ship, just out of interest. It didn't start the Australia run until quite a bit after it was launched. This is the shipping list. Quite a few of you asked to talk about shipping lists, and I came across this one in my travels in the last few weeks. A Margaret MacLennan, nee MacLennan, from an island there near Lewis and so on, married a fellow called Roderick. In Scotland, they would say Kerr. I would say Kerr. That's my grandmother was one of them. They travelled on this ship here, Stebon Heath, to Victoria, I think. Yeah. And you can see here that, look, it says the name is Carr on there, C-A-R-R, the Irish spelling of that name. And then down here it says, should have been Kerr, or Care, as you would say. So that's a clue. And then over here, this is Margaret. This is an arrival document, don't forget, not a departure document like those Immigration Society ones we talked about earlier. This is when they arrived. And the writing on here, it's hard to read for you, but it says parents names, gives the parents of the husband and the parents of the mother. Roderick, it says Roddick, or R-O-D-K, MacLelland with a double L, and Janet MacLeod, spelled C-L-O-U-D, Janet MacLeod. So if you can see the pattern of the family here, the bit like a census, you know, and you can go to her record. This is her record in the clan records, and you can see exactly that same pattern there in the shipping. This is the transcription of the shipping record, and there she is. And there's her father, Roderick, as said there, MacLellan but MacLennan, and she's called Janet MacLennan on the shipping record, but she's called Jessie here. We know about that from our earlier sessions, to expect that. She's not called MacLeod with a, you know, like a cloud in the sky. She's called MacLeod in the more conventional way here. And there's Roderick, the husband. We got it. He dies in Melbourne, not long after they arrive, actually, it looks like. And here's the only one missing in this list of people arriving is the last one. Janet, got the name of her grandmother. And when you go out there and look at Janet, you see, died at sea in 1851 on the voyage. It all fits. Hey, that's the fun of it, isn't it? What we're all doing here, the fun of researching your ancestors, does it fit? That's the sort of thing. Quickly, New Zealand, I don't want to spend long on this. This was the very first settlement in New Zealand of Europeans. It's on the quite north part. And here you had settling 3 brothers who came from Lochhouse Parish. They got there in 1838 to this part. This is a picture, a painting in 1845. So they've been there for a really long time at this point. But you see, it's still a tiny place. And this is the only place where there's settlement in New Zealand at this time. Donald, the brother from Lochhouse, died at sea, going backwards and forwards to Sydney to buy supplies for their store here in Russell, the place is called, or this is the full New Zealand name, unpronounceable. And the brother Ewan, you can still see his headstone in a church about here. It's a sort of horizontal headstone. You can look him up in our records. There's a nice little museum there. Lovely spot to visit, actually. And then Duncan, the other brother who continued on, went on to be a great success, and his sons were members of Parliament and were a great wealthy family in New Zealand. The big thing in New Zealand is this Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in. They took it round to all the Maori chiefs, and they signed it at different times, but about 1840-ish. So after these people had already got there, from Lochhouse, the MacLennans. And this is a sort of big picture of New Zealand. I won't go through all that detail. But for Canadians, of course, you've got to know that there was this Waipu place, which is up here north of Auckland. That place I talked about a minute ago is in here in the Bay of Islands. Then between Auckland and Russell, you have Waipu, this lovely spot where these people who came from Cape Breton, mainly St Anne's Bay and Middle River, those parts, settled. They came in 6 ships in the 1850s. The first voyage went to Adelaide in South Australia and then on to Melbourne. And then they took a different way to get to settle in somewhere in New Zealand and chose this place here. Wellington settlement started in 1840, really. There was just a small survey boat and then a couple more boats came in 1840 to settle here in the Cook Straits, known as Windy Wellington to all of us today. And then Christchurch, they talk about the first 4 ships arriving in Christchurch in 1850, but in fact, Scots were well established in Christchurch long before that, in particular out here on the Banks Peninsula, but also just inland from Christchurch. And they gave the name Avon to the river, which is the name of a Scottish river, not the Shakespearean one, because their uncle had a house on the Avon in Ayrshire. And then you have this totally Scottish name here. This just means the same, exactly the same. In Gaelic, it means the same as Edinburgh in Scotland means, Eden Hill. Dun is hill in Gaelic. Edinburgh is the same in Eden Hill. And a Glasgow-based group associated with the Free Church. Remember, the Free Church had only been created in 1843. Settled this place and then discovered gold there inland from Dunedin, making it by 1880 the largest and most wealthy city in New Zealand. You wouldn't know that today. It's quite a university town today. But then the great move north started to happen well after this 1880 time. This is a photo out of my book, Friends, Family and Forebears, somewhere here. That was made for that purpose, but I just used it for this. You can look up that book, my book there online. And this is my last slide. Today, the Duncan MacLennan of the Russell fame, this fella here, Duncan MacLennan, went to Auckland and south of Auckland, he settled on a part that this picture was only taken at the weekend. 2 days ago, I took this photo from the website, a new community called MacLennan. New neighbourhood in south of Auckland. And if you go there to this site, it's just called MacLennan.co.nz is the website. You can hear these guys with really strong Kiwi accents saying, come and join us in our new neighbourhood of MacLennan.